I'm Will Fenton, Director of Research and Public Programs at the Library Company of Philadelphia. As you probably heard me say before, the Library Company was founded by Benjamin Franklin back in the early 18th century, but today we are an independent research library with specializations in all things early Americana, book history, print culture, visual culture, women's history, African-American history, and business and political economy. And this series, Fireside Chats, is sustained almost entirely by the generosity and sense of duty of our former fellows. I kicked this off last April and we're still going. And I didn't anticipate this being a weekly series, but thanks to your generosity, we've kept it going. And I, for one, am very grateful for that. For those of you just joining us for the first time, this is a little different from your typical Zoom. Your camera, your microphone, they are not enabled. That is by design. It is 7 o'clock on a Thursday night. Take a break, pour yourself a big old glass of wine, make yourself some dinner, listen in, watch as you wish. And at the same time, I invite you to participate, mainly through the Q&A function. We have 2 overlapping dialogue buttons at the bottom of your screen. That's a great place to tuck in questions for me, and I will do my very best to make sure that we get to as many as we can in the last 15 minutes or so of this talk. But most of this talk is going to be reserved for our special presenter. We're going to hear about a great book tonight. Michael Hattem received his PhD in history from Yale University. He's taught at Knox College and Lang College at the New School, and he's currently the Associate Director of the Yale-New Haven Teachers Institute. Dr. Hattem is a producer and contributor to the Junto Cast, the first podcast on early American history, as well as History Talks, a new YouTube channel delivering content created by historians. That's important. He's been awarded fellowships from the American Philosophical Society, the New York Historical Society, the Massachusetts Historical Society, Mount Vernon, and other institutions. And his work and his writings have been featured in the New York Times and the Washington Post. But perhaps most importantly, Dr. Hattem was a Library Company McNeil Fellow in 2016-2017. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Will. Thank you. And so I want to begin by thanking Will and everyone else at the Library Company, especially Jim Green and Connie King. My time there really was fantastically productive. And that's thanks really to the Library Company's amazing collections and its equally amazing staff. So it's sort of a long-held commonplace that Americans have traditionally been less interested in their past than in their present and their future. And one of the ways that we often see this supposed disinterest is in the somewhat annual, I should say somewhat depressing annual reports that show that an overwhelming majority of Americans think that knowing our history is important, but at the same time, they also show how little Americans actually know about that history. A number of historians have actually argued that this disregard for the past was a product of the Revolutionary era and of Americans sort of liberating themselves from the past through the Revolution. But my book, Past and Prologue, uncovers an unprecedented explosion of historical cultural production in the Revolutionary era that went well beyond just typical historical works or histories of. And so to try to understand how Americans at the time thought about and understood the past, I went looking for any and all representations and uses of the past. So that means in political writings, but also in cultural productions like poetry, fiction, children's textbooks, and almanacs, and things like that. And what I found was that the historical past really pervaded the politics and culture of the Revolutionary era in ways that I think historians are yet to fully recognize or reckon with. And so the central question behind the book as a whole has to do with national identity and the American Revolution, right? So that is, how did colonists go from thinking of themselves as British subjects to thinking of themselves as American citizens? Now, before 1760, most British colonists thought of the British past as their history. But by 1800, that's really no longer the case. And that's a really significant transformation, right? How does a society go about discarding a previously shared past and create a new one to replace it? And how do they do that amidst the upheaval and instability of revolution? And so my book tells the story of this transformation through three processes. Basically, how colonists began to reconsider their relationship to the British past, how they created a newly shared colonial past for the first time, and also how, after the war, they created a deep national past, or a sort of a sense of American antiquity. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But fundamentally, my book argues that these changing historical memories are really necessary to better understand both the coming of the American Revolution and the origins of American national identity. So I'm going to begin by saying a little bit about the book's origins. It began as my dissertation in graduate school and was originally intended to explore British historical memory in the colonies up to 1776. But while I was doing research in the John Jay papers at the New York Historical Society, I found a manuscript. I'm going to show it to you here. And you can see this is the cover page of what was a 500+ page manuscript. And you can see that it reads History of the American Revolution. And there's a notation on the last line that says, found among the papers of Governor William Livingston, who had been the revolutionary governor of New Jersey. And I'd worked on Livingston, and I knew that he hadn't written a history of the revolution. So I effectively started trying to figure out just what this was. And it was about 550 manuscript pages. And after I started transcribing it and analyzed the text and the handwriting, I discovered that it was an early draft manuscript of the first 6 chapters of David Ramsey's History of the American Revolution. And this is one of the most popular historical works of the early national period. And so after I identified it, I was able to compare this early draft, which was written and sent around in 1785, with the final published version that came out about 5 years later in 1790. And the biggest change that I saw was really in the first chapter, which in the draft spent a lot of time recounting the history of Britain in the 17th century. But in the published version, that was largely cut out and replaced with sort of individual histories of the various colonies' settlement and development. And so it was finding that manuscript and the changes in it that really convinced me to enlarge the scope of my project to include the early national period and to focus on the broader process that was exemplified by these changes in the manuscript, and especially the question that it raised, which was when and how did Americans stop thinking of the British past as their own and create a quote unquote American history to replace it? And that's really the question at the heart of the book. And so I'm going to start by talking about a few key facts regarding what I call history culture in the 18th century. And the first of those has to do with historical distance, right? And this is basically a term that it's supposed to be a sort of sense of how far something in the past seems from the present moment, right? And colonial history culture before the revolution was defined, at least in part, by the fact that historical distance in the 18th century was quite truncated. So even the sort of distant past retained an immediacy and a sort of contemporary resonance. And while the colonies were undergoing quite rapid economic and social changes, for the vast majority of colonists who were engaged in rural agriculture, and this is 98% of the population, the basic rhythms of their daily lives were really not all that different from those of their ancestors of hundreds of years past, which is to say that to them, the past really did not seem as far away as we might assume. I mean, we live in this contemporary society and sort of technological and other developments have really sort of inflated our sense of historical distance. But that's really not the case in the 18th century. And for many people in the 18th century, this sort of shortened sense of historical distance really contributed to a more intimate relationship between the past and the present, and what we might think of as a more sort of intensely historicized present. Another key fact to understand about history culture in the 18th century is Americans' sort of cultural reverence for the authority of the past. And this is partly because they lived in a common law culture, right, that gave great weight to custom, precedent, tradition. And in such a culture, there's a tendency to bestow legitimacy on something because it had existed for a significant period of time. And this reverence for the authority of the past manifested itself in sort of two key ways for understanding history culture's role in both the imperial crisis, so the 1760s and 1770s, and in the early national period. So first, it applied directly to colonists' relationship with Britain, which they understood as having been legally defined by the sort of laissez-faire custom of the previous half century or more. But more broadly, it offered colonists before the Revolution a sense of security and stability because it allowed them to develop expectations about the present and the near future based on the past, right? The custom and precedent of the colony's relationship with Britain allowed them to feel secure in their expectations that that relationship would not just suddenly change. Of course, when Parliament began to undertake their sort of program of imperial reforms in the 1760s, that relationship did suddenly change. And Parliament was seen as usurping the authority of the past through its unprecedented legislation, like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts and the Tea Act. And this really caused colonists no small amount of anxiety and instability because they could no longer anticipate what would happen next. John Adams expressed this anxiety and the sort of logic behind it when he asked incredulously during the Stamp Act crisis, are we not to prophesy the future by the experience of the past? So for many Americans today, I think, we need only look back to the last 4 years to understand the anxiety that unprecedented behavior by the government and or its leaders can cause amongst individuals and communities. And Parliament's behavior in the 1760s had another sort of cultural impact on many colonists, and that was that they began to think about the British past differently. So the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which ended the sort of tyranny of the Stuart monarchs of the 17th century and established the constitutional monarchy by significantly expanding the powers of Parliament at the expense of the king. The creation of other aspects or I should say, other aspects that come out of the Glorious Revolution of 1688, like, say, the creation of the Board of Trade and the national debt and the expansion of the Navy. All of these things combined to give a sense to Britons and colonists in the 18th century that the Glorious Revolution had really laid the foundation for the British Empire's 18th century success. And so for that reason, it played a really fundamental role in most Britain's civic identity, in Britain and in the colonies. And in that sense, it's really not unlike how many Americans have long related to the American Revolution, right? Seeing the principles that it established as the foundation on which the nation was built and from which it should always proceed. But when Parliament began to pass all kinds of unprecedented legislation, and colonists had realized that they had no one else to appeal to, they started to see the Glorious Revolution differently. And their experiences in the 1760s and 1770s really called into question the meaning of an event that had been fundamental to their identity as subjects of the most successful and free empire in the world. And they came to see the Glorious Revolution not as having achieved, some ideal balance between king and parliament, but instead as having simply reversed their roles by creating the circumstances in which a parliament could act as arbitrarily and tyrannically as any 17th century monarch. And so this development in the 1760s actually also has some contemporary resonance in that many Americans today are broadly reconsidering the meaning of the American Revolution and the usefulness of its legacy in our political culture. So another key aspect of the authority of the past in 18th century history culture was the importance of what they called first principles. This is an idea that colonists had inherited from 17th century British culture. And what's going on there is that they had a very cyclical understanding of history. And that is that they understood that societies inevitably rose and fell according in part to their virtue. And so how can a society temporarily stave off its inevitable decline? By returning to its first principles, right? And this is an idea that still retains significant political power in the United States today, if we think about legal originalism or even the movements like the Tea Party. So for colonists like Britons, this idea of first principles had meant the English Constitution and the ideals of the Glorious Revolution. But during the imperial crisis and then later after the war, Parliament's actions really called those principles into question, and colonists began to look for new first principles in their own colonial past, and that's really the subjects that's covered in the first half of the book, especially in the second and third chapter. And then finally, one other thing that we need to understand is that before the revolution, there's really there's no sense of a shared American past before the revolution. No sense of sort of a colonial history that would incorporate all of the colonies. And I think, many historians have sort of long assumed that the idea of American history came about after the revolution. My book actually argues that it was a driving force behind the revolution, beginning during the imperial crisis of the 1760s and 1770s. And so the first half of the book really shows how, because of the crisis, American colonists began reconsidering their relationship to the British past because of Parliament's actions. And they also began to construct a sense of a shared colonial past for the first time. But it isn't really until after the war that a coherent narrative begins to take shape. And so I want to spend the rest of my time talking a little bit about that narrative and some of its themes, and say something about who was included and who was not included and why. And so in thinking about the forging of a national history, the creation of a national history in the period after the Revolutionary War, and the role of the colonial past in that national history, it's really important to keep in mind that unlike most European nations, the United States was in a somewhat unique situation that was later followed by many post-colonial South American nations, of having had their historical origins in the form of their colonial past documented, right, rather than sort of lost to the vast expanse of time. And that really provided a unique challenge, which was, how do you incorporate a dependent colonial past into the national history of an independent republic? And so in the early national period, there are these cultural nationalist writers, and I talk about them a lot in the book, and some of them are names that will be easily recognizable to people who are connected to the library company, like Benjamin Rush, and people like that. And then there are some who are a bit more obscure, but these cultural nationalist writers of all genres really contributed to the broad projects of fostering national identity after the war, and of establishing cultural independence from Britain, right? And the creation of a new national history was a real fundamental part of those projects. This new national history would begin with the American or colonial past rather than the British past. And that is the broader change that we saw manifested in that Ramsey manuscript that I mentioned earlier. And so nationalist writers and artists and others did this by basically reimagining a sort of shared colonial past and basically argued that the colonies had always been effectively independent from Britain and that they'd always been united. And if you look at the cover, the cover of the book, if you look at the shield, you can see that the two words on the shield are union and independence. And this is an image from the very early 19th century. But you can see, these are really core themes in the 1780s and 1790s as the new nation is trying to find its way. And so not only were the colonies characterized as having been independent from Britain and united, in his History of the Revolution, David Ramsey also basically turns the first settlers of New England into proper 18th century patriots. So there's a famous quote from his history where he says that the political creed of an American colonist was short but substantial. He believed that God made all mankind originally equal, and that he endowed them with the rights of life, property, and as much liberty as was consistent with the rights of others. And that, impressed with sentiments of this kind, they grew up from their earliest infancy with a prepossession in favor of independence. And so what Ramsey's doing here is basically turning these first settlers into proto-signers of the Declaration of Independence. And asserting this kind of historical independence from Britain was a key way in which cultural nationalists tried to foster a sense of cultural independence from Britain after the war, right? The idea there is we were never really under British authority. We never really had any affection for Britain, and we were always united together. Now, none of these things are really historically accurate from our vantage point, certainly. But for someone at the time, taking those things together, it was really meant to imply to them that Americans had, in fact, never really been British, right? And we can see this in some sense in a map, which I'm going to show you here. This is David Ramsey's map, historical and biographical chart, which he made in 1810 with the idea of sort of selling them to schools. And I'm going to show you the inset here, the chart in the top right corner. It's color-coded. Not all of them were color-coded. He had his daughters color them, some of them, and then sold them for a higher price. But what you can see here is that if you can see that many of the colonies enjoyed what Ramsey calls free government up until 1688, 1689, right, the time of the Glorious Revolution, at which point they lost their independence. And this goes back to Americans rethinking of the Glorious Revolution during the 1760s and 1770s, and coming to see it as allowing Parliament to exercise arbitrary power over the colonies and creating the situation that led to the declaring of independence. We can see that manifested here in Ramsey's chart. And so if we think about it more deeply, there's a narrative to this chart, right? And so the story that Ramsey's map is telling is that the revolution was about regaining something that had been lost, not about creating something entirely new, right? It's a very conservative interpretation of the revolution. And we can get a sense here of how these interpretations of the colonial past were also interrelated with the politics of the period. For example, cultural nationalists used their historical cultural productions, which might be any kind of cultural production that uses historical themes or content, how they use those and to promote these interpretations. And we can get a sense of how those interpretations effectively buttressed the authority of the new and tenuous federal government in the 1780s, and then after the Constitutional Convention in the 1790s. Incidents like Shays' Rebellion, where the participants adopted revolutionary rhetoric, really highlighted the need to these cultural nationalists to make the past less co-optable by the discontented, right? And so this historical memory of the colonial past that we can see in Ramseys' chart and in many works from the period really tried to achieve that goal, primarily by stressing continuities between the past and the present, right? And by doing that, they effectively minimized the sense of historical change that was wrought by the revolution for their audience. These historical works and historical cultural productions argued that the revolution was fought to preserve colonist independence, right? So the revolution then appears to have been the product of deep systemic long-term issues, sort of that had been sort of baked into the imperial cake, you might say, rather than a sudden or spontaneous reaction, right? Like these protests occurring in the 1780s and 1790s. And so by creating a narrative in which the colonial past looked like the 1780s and 1790s, these writers made it so that independence represented continuity rather than rupture. And this new colonial past effectively de-radicalized the revolution at a time when these cultural nationalists were really trying to help rein in the popular spirit that had been unleashed by the revolution, especially in the years before and just after the Constitution. So part of establishing cultural independence from Britain meant creating a national history that at least in some ways could transcend the history of Britain and the British Empire. And this is, I talk about in the book, how this is how Columbus becomes the discoverer of America, thanks to the efforts of a number of these cultural nationalists who sort of took advantage of the 300th anniversary in 1792 to make him that. And that's because he provided a non-British origin story for the new national history, right? Even though he never set foot on the North American continent. Another way that they sought to create a history that transcended the history of Britain or England was through a growing interest in the natural history of the land itself. And so famously in the 1760s, the Comte de Buffon, who was a famous French scientist, had described both the landscape of North America and its animal inhabitants as degenerated and sort of in comparison, I should say, to Europe. And the land and the climate of North America, he argued, produced smaller and weaker animals. And so subsequent European writers somewhat logically extended that argument to include the human inhabitants of North America. So first Native Americans, and then later, by extension, American colonists. And American intellectuals in the 1780s and 1790s really sought desperately to refute this degeneracy theory. Many state histories devoted long sections, in some cases entire volumes, to describing the land and its produce, often referring to these European writers by name when they did so. And this impulse is actually what gave rise to the nation's first natural history museums. I'm going to show you an image. This is Charles Wilson Peale. This is the artist in his museum. This is what the name of the painting. And Peale established the first natural history museum, the Peale Museum in Philadelphia in the 1780s. He was a painter who had made a living painting elites, but had become interested in natural history, and his interests really collided in the museum to serve nationalist purposes. See in this other famous painting of the museum of what was called its long room by his son, Rembrandt Peale, you can see specimens of species that are indigenous to North America lining the wall in these cases. And that's to be expected in a natural history museum. But along the top of the walls were hung large portraits that Peale had painted of prominent figures from the War for Independence. And most historians have assumed that the display was inspired by the sort of taxonomy of the Enlightenment. So the idea was that man was on top of the animals because that's where he stood in the natural world. But if we look again and understand Peele's museum as part of the broader history culture of the early Republic, we can also see that what he also did was to create for his visitors a visual manifestation of the connection between the natural history of the continent and the history of the new nation. So in the museum's catalog, Peele wrote of what he called the tendency that a knowledge of natural history has to promote national happiness. And so for visitors to the museum, the prominent placement of these revolutionary portraits and busts within the museum really provided an immediate and meaningful visual connection between the revolutionary past, which established the nation, and its deep past. In other words, its natural history, right? A few years later, he would find what all the cultural nationalists had been looking for, which was an animal bigger than any in Europe. And, because this would irrefutably refute once and for all the degeneracy theory. And so parts of a mastodon, or a mammoth, as they called it, were found in upstate New York in the early 19th century. And Peele bought the rights to the site from John Maston, who owned the land. He offered him $200 for the right to the bones that had been found and to continue digging. And Peele did that and eventually uncovered almost entire skeleton, which went on display in his museum in Philadelphia. And you can see it a little bit here behind Peele. It became the main attraction at the museum, and it was really a huge sensation in both the United States and Europe. And this interest in the land also extended to an interest in its indigenous inhabitants. One French natural history writer noted in 1804 that many Americans make it their favorite business to combat European writers, and they act as if they were the advocates and avengers of their predecessors, the Indians, unquote. Many of these cultural nationalist writers, especially those writing, historical works, made analogies between contact era Native Americans and the Americans of the 1780s and 1790s, sort of like they did in that with the Puritans in that Ramsey quote. So when the historian of Vermont, Samuel Williams, wrote of the tendency and effect of a certain government being equality, freedom, and independence, he was actually speaking of indigenous governments. And in a talk given at the New York Historical Society in 1804, Gouverneur Morris said that, he said, we grow out of the same ground with our Indian predecessors. Have we not some traits to mark our common origin? And this idea of, or this practice of linking history and geography to sort of nationalize the land, because this is what's happening here. These cultural nationalists are trying to nationalize the natural history of the land. This idea really formed the foundation for a perspective on American history that was voiced by Daniel Webster in 1825, when he said that the principles of free government adheres to the American soil, right? So just as these nationalists were projecting their present onto their own colonial past, they also projected their present onto the past of indigenous peoples. And they, in this period, they sort of constructed their own history for Native Americans that because it proved useful in their cultural project of fostering a new national identity. And of course, this is at the same time that efforts had already begun by the federal government and the states to displace Native Americans from their indigenous lands. So much as the new United States fought a anti-colonial rebellion only to begin forging its own empire across the rest of the continent, these cultural nationalists adopted sort of common colonial cultural practices in trying to navigate their post-colonial circumstances. And just as the state and federal governments did the same in the realm of politics and policy. And so their histories and the stories that they told about themselves were just as contradictory or paradoxical as their rhetoric and actions in the present, right? And as a nation that has inherited their conception, their original creation, which of American history, we've also inherited those complex paradoxes. And it's one of the reasons why there's a significance to our present that comes from these choices that were made by the revolutionary generation when they literally created what many Americans have thought of ever since as quote unquote American history. And so I'm going to conclude really briefly by just saying a few things about what I hope readers will get out of the book. And so one of the things is that, for a long time, we've had many different types of arguments or interpretations of the coming of the American Revolution, whether it's an economic interpretation or constitutional interpretation. But in the book, I've really tried to offer one possible aspect of what might be considered the cultural origins and causes of the revolution. And I've tried to recover some part of the complex role of the past in our nation's founding. And I really hope that that sheds light on its role in our current society. I show in the book that when Americans found themselves with a new nation, whose history only went back a few years to 1776, they created a shared past for themselves, pretty much out of scratch. And that is what we call American history still to this day. Many Americans continue to think about American history on the foundation and the terms that were set by the revolutionary generation. And so I also hope that readers will come away from the book with a better appreciation of how history shapes the present and vice versa, specifically how that worked during the revolution. And I hope that they'll come away equipped to be more aware of when specific narratives of the past are being used and to ask why and for whom. And so when a reader hears people complaining that history is being politicized by some person or group, they should know that American history has always been political in the United States. It can't not be political because that's not a bug. It's a feature of American history. And so finally, I hope that readers will come away understanding that quote unquote American history is not a neutral, objective term, but instead represents something that was originally constructed, and that revising how we think about the past and our own history, it really is an American tradition that played a crucial role in the founding of the nation. And so I'd like to say thank you to the Library Company for hosting this talk and to everyone watching, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael. That was incredibly rich and timely talk. I'd like to sit in this moment for just a second to kick us off. It seems that the story you're telling is one of sort of removal, even disavowal of this English past and replacement with a sort of shared American identity. How is it that we've sort of come full circle and now we have an Anglo-Saxon caucus in the GOP?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I talk a little bit in the book about, the place of the sort of Anglo-Saxon myth in the way that some people in the 18th century thought about English history. Maybe Thomas Jefferson most famously. But you're right. I mean, that's basically one of the things that I find interesting about sort of coming full circle is that a lot of the efforts and ideas that went into creating this first national history or national historical narrative was about creating a sense of historical distance from Britain.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And now, but here we are, over 200 years later, we have sort of, academics are still trying to get outside of the boundaries, the geographical boundaries, the temporal boundaries that were set by this revolutionary generation of historians. And one of the main critiques of those boundaries is that they're so Anglo-centric, right? When the people who created them thought that what they were doing was getting away from that, right? So there's a cyclical aspect there. When I talk about how colonists in the 18th century thought about history cyclically, as opposed to thinking about it in a sort of linear, progressive manner, which is sort of a late 18th century idea, sort of late Enlightenment idea. It might at first seem very unintuitive, but when you see moments like this where things sort of cycle around, you know what I mean? You start to think, oh, well, maybe they had some reason for thinking that.
A question here from Michael Winship, who asks, and this is a question that I actually share, how did this manuscript, that is Ramsey's draft, that 1775 manuscript that you showed us at the beginning, how did that end up in the John Jay papers?
Yeah. So Ramsey, I later found out from doing research in Ramsey's papers in Philadelphia that he had sent out a few copies of the first 6 chapters of his History of the Revolution to what he called, quote unquote, Eastern gentlemen, looking for feedback. And I talk in the book, in chapter 4 in the book, about how there was this sort of informal historical network of these cultural nationalists, especially historical writers, who would, send their work to one another looking for feedback, sort of like an 18th century writers group, or working group. But so that's what he did. He sent a few of these copies around, and of course, this is over 500 manuscript pages that he, obviously had to write out by hand. The one that I found, I don't know if it was, like the 6th time that he was writing all this, because it was very tough to read the writing,
Yeah.
But so he sent them around to get some feedback, and I think that what happened is that he sent a copy to William Livingston, because Livingston had helped him publish the book, his first book, which was A History of the Revolution of South Carolina, which he published earlier in the 1780s. And so John Jay, of course, was William Livingston's son-in-law. And so when Livingston died in 1790, most of his papers went to John Jay. And then that's how it makes its way into the Jay papers at the New York Historical Society. And when I found it, it was just identified by the title page, like William Livingston's History of the American Revolution. And like I said, I knew that he hadn't written that. And so, so I was able to identify this unidentified manuscript. One of the funny stories that goes along with that is that he sent one of these copies of the manuscript to Charles Thompson, who was the secretary of the Continental Congress. And Thompson responded by offering some corrections to Ramsey's chapters, and also sharing like a story of his own from what was going on in Philadelphia, right, in the build up to independence. And Ramsey copied the story from Thompson's letter wholesale, like the 18th century equivalent of copying and pasting into his manuscript. And many years later, about 20 years later, when he was, I think he was working on a revised edition, he had to write to Charles Thompson to ask him for more specifics about the story that he had put into his manuscript, as if he was telling the story. But of course, I talk about this in the book, plagiarism was not really a thing in the 18th century, and almost all of these historians, did this kind of copying and pasting.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to me to see that this sort of predates the war, this process of removal and replacement that these cultural nationalists are undergoing. I mean, this is 1775, so this work starts early.
Yeah. I mean, that's really, I think, one of the, for historians at least, that's one of the interventions, I think, up until throughout the 19th century, well into the 20th century, most people thought that an American national identity had developed over the course of the colonial period, right? And that was what made independence possible, right, by 1776. In the last few decades, historians have come to sort of accept the idea that there was no sense of shared national identity at the time of independence, and that it was really something that developed, in the early republic, after the war. So I'm, in some sense, sort of splitting the difference between those two extreme positions to say this begins before independence. It's abstract and it's a little ambiguous, but it's there, right? So the seeds of what develops after the war, are already planted, and they're planted, because of the politics of the crisis.
Yeah, exactly. So we have a couple of questions that sort of rotate around Ramsey a little bit, so I'm going to try to pull them together. First, Mark Bunshoft writes, some of the cultural nationalists that you discuss also wrote state histories. For example, Ramsey on South Carolina or Belknap on New Hampshire. Did these state histories reinforce the new nationalist story that you argue emerged after the revolution?
Yeah. So they absolutely do. I mean, it's interesting because the number of historians who have worked on, the writing of history in the period, is rather small, and sort of bunched around the bicentennial, for obvious reasons. Mm-hmm. The idea there was one historian, at least, who argued that the existence of the state histories showed that localism was still predominant, right? But you only have to really look at the introductions or the prefaces of many of those state histories to see that they understood themselves as contributing, their state's part to a new national historical narrative, right? Not just, we see that in many of these, at the beginning of many of these state histories, but also, lots of essays written in magazines and newspapers, by these writers and by others, other sort of cultural nationalists who understood that was the role of these state histories, right? It's much easier to create a national history if you have all of these individual state histories that are already written, that can, be in 20th century terms or 21st century terms plagiarized, but so the existence of state histories is not, does not preclude or is not evidence, for the lack of a sentiment toward, a national identity. It really was an important constituent part of it. Yeah.
Excellent. We have another question related to Ramsey from a fellow that might have overlapped with you, Nicole Dressler, who writes, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the chart from David Ramsey that you had showed. How typical or atypical was such an image? And you mentioned that his daughters colored them. And so do we know what roles they might have played in his work?
Yeah, so I talk a little bit in the first chapter of the book about the sort of the origins of historical charts, and Joseph Priestley produces some of the first, real, I should say popular historical charts in England in the 1750s, biographical charts and what he called the new chart of history. And there, Ramsey is effectively drawing on both in this, in his map. I'll put it back up here. Ramsey created this map in 1810, and the idea was that he would sell it to schools, and you could get an uncolored or a colored version, and the colored version cost more. And again, his daughters, I found from his correspondence that his daughters created these, did the coloring on these maps. I've got this copy, saw this copy at the American Philosophical Society, and it's huge. It like took up a whole huge table, right? It's not small. And the only other copy that I've seen was at the New York Public Library, and they have an uncolored version of it. And his idea, was that not just that the map would be sold to schools, but there was also an accompanying pamphlet that came with it. that sort of that gave more detail about the various points of time in the things that are signaled in the historical chart. And there's also beneath that a biographical chart with men's names, where so he would include these sort of short biographies of some of the most prominent of them. This is not common. I mean, like the number of examples of these types of historical charts from, say, prior to 1820 is quite small. So it was not something that was very common. Certainly ones of this size were not common. And in the end, it doesn't seem that Ramsey sold a whole ton of these, and not many are still extant. So, it doesn't appear to have been a very profitable exercise for him. But if you read the book, you'll see that that doing any kind of historical cultural production like this in these years was not profitable for most of them.
Yeah, and on the topic of profitability, I would encourage all of you to explore the chat feature where I dropped a link where you can purchase this book from Yale University Press. We definitely want to support our university presses, and we want to support our wonderful authors. I've got a question here from D. Plunkett, who writes, even in the 18th century, the European residents of North America were a diverse group speaking different languages. How did this linguistic diversity influence the development of an American history?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I would say first, I think is the case that there's a great amount, relatively speaking, of ethnic diversity, right, in the colonies on the eve of the Revolution. But what I found was if we look at various ethnic groups, from various what we would think of as German sort of principalities, or even French Huguenots, various groups from outside of England that came to the colonies. Many of them retained their ethnic identities, right? But that did not preclude them from also adopting British civic identity, right? So you could still be ethnically a French Huguenot and yet have developed this British civic identity, like I talked about, in the beginning of the talk, that's sort of based on the idea of the importance of the Glorious Revolution, right? Having created this empire that was the most free empire in the world, the most commercial empire in the world, and really take that to heart, and that could live side by side by these various ethnic groups. So it certainly did not preclude their participation in an understanding of the importance of the British past to a place where they were living, right? And then the same would go for after the Revolution for the American past. I did find some what we would think of as foreign language histories, early histories of the United States from around the turn of the 19th century or just after, including one in German. But those were, the circulation of those was relatively small, right? But their existence says something, right? That it says that whether it's before the Revolution, and we're talking about the British past, or after, and we talk about the American past, that it was clear even to these foreign groups that developing a sense of the past was an important part of their own civic identity.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to try to open the aperture here, and if I can, I'm going to try to squeeze two questions in here. Jelaine Bauer writes, are there other countries, that is former colonies, that went through a similar construction of their own history?
I mean, so there are others that experienced similar dynamics, right? And I sort of mentioned this earlier in the talk, which is about these post-colonial South American nations had to face many of the same questions. Their earliest generations of historians had to face many of the same questions that were faced by the American historians in the 1780s and 1790s. And that has to do with, what do we do with this colonial past, right? There are instances in the literature on some of these South American countries where the colonial past just did not get included in early national histories. Like that's that independence meant a sort of year one, right? The beginning of a year one.
Yeah.
And that they felt that they could not reconcile, their colonial past with their independent present, right? Or their independent projected future. But the Americans, for various reasons, and part of it, I think, I hope that it comes through in the book, is that history culture was so embedded in colonial society, it was never really, I don't think, an option, for Americans, former colonists, to suddenly, throw the past off, even though that's how historians have thought about them for a long time. This idea that the revolution liberated Americans from the past. It liberated them from, maybe from the old world, you might say, right? Or the history of the old world. But, they replace that. They replace that with their own deep national past. They replace that with their own colonial histories and arguing, for a much longer sort of span of independence than you would typically think. So history was very important in the colonies, in colonial culture, and that's why it's sort of, that's one of the reasons why it carries over after the revolution and provides a sort of different result than we saw in some South American countries later on.
That's great, and a really nice synthetic place for us to wind this conversation down. I'm sorry to all of those who I didn't get to your questions. They're all wonderful as always, but thank you all for your time on this Thursday evening. A gale is kicking up here in Philadelphia, so I know it's about time to adjourn. And thank you in particular, Michael Hattem, for sharing your wonderful book with us.
Thank you.
Have a great night, everyone.